Lucia's been and gone to take her daughter, so hopefully she'll jump in soon.
Okay. All righty, well, I think we'll get started here. This is the Town of Camden Planning Board meeting of September 7, 2023. The primary item on the agenda is a presentation by Granicus on short-term rentals and the data and enforcement options they offer. Looking around, I'm going to just say, is there any public comment or comment on non-agenda items from anyone at this moment? All right, seeing none, we'll just move right along in the agenda then. So no minutes to approve, and we're right to the presentation. So Jeffrey, I think you're taking the lead on this. We've all received the PDF. I'm guessing the board has all had an opportunity to look it over. And we're just interested to hear what you have to say. And I'd like to thank Jeremy and Shenley for setting this up. And you have the floor.
Great. I'm actually going to let Samantha drive this. Much friendlier face with my uncharacteristic
Great.
summer beard.
Samantha, go for it. You have the floor.
Perfect. So first, we'll just start introducing ourselves. So my name's Samantha. I'm the account executive for Granicus Host Compliance. So I've actually been working across Maine to help different communities to address their short-term rental related challenges since 2019. But I've been involved in the short-term rental market since the relatively early days, 2013. So 10 years now that I've been involved in the short-term rental market. Yes, my face probably makes me seem a lot younger than I actually am. So really just being able to give you guys some information about the short-term rental market, some of the analysis that we have around what's happening in Camden at the moment. And then I'll turn it over to Jeffrey, who is our consultant planner. Just a bit of an introduction about Jeffrey. Has a huge amount of experience in terms of helping different communities in creating regulations. I would say he's probably one of the biggest experts in this marketplace in terms of creating regulations and just understanding what works, what doesn't work. And so when Jeremy and Shenley, we spoke originally, I thought it'd just be great to have both myself in terms of the analysis, the data, what's actually happening in the marketplace, and as well Jeffrey and his knowledge of creating regulations, because you guys are sort of at the beginning of this process. So with that, I'll turn over to Jeffrey. He can do more of an introduction. I will share my screen and then we can kick off from there.
Sure. I was waiting to hear what adjective you used to describe me. My name is Jeffrey Goodman. I'm a trained urban planner. I have been working on short-term rental issues now as a planner since 2014, 2015, something like that. Working with communities around the country and in Canada on how to develop regulations, how to learn from what other places are doing, how to tailor your ordinance, your systems to not just the sort of legal situation or the real estate situation, but your goals, your values, how to make a system that's going to work and work for your community in the way that you want it to. So I've been very blessed to be able to touch so many communities and work with them on this issue that it cuts across people's money and it cuts across people's homes. So it's a rare planning issue that people get really fired up about. I've lots of friends who are planners who work on, I don't know, bike lanes and pocket parks. And this one is a little bit more, often a little bit more fraught. So I'm very glad to be here, and I'll let Samantha go through some of the data.
Perfect. Thanks for that. Okay, so we'll whiz right along. Just to sort of set the scene, some of the things that we know about the short-term rental market is that without having some sort of system in place, less than 10% of owners voluntarily register, pay all of their fair share of permitting fees, taxes, so on and so forth. I will say in the time that I have worked across host compliance, we do see these numbers very much match up. People will start a program, and year 1, year 2, year 3, they'll come back to us and say, yeah, we've reached about 10%, max 20% of registrations. The reasons, everybody's not trying to game the system. Sometimes they don't actually know that you guys have regulations. They're not involved in sort of the day-to-day politics of what's happening within a town. And because the short-term rental market is very much transient, what will happen is there is the possibility that people who are transacting this marketplace don't actually live in your community. And so they just aren't necessarily fully aware of what's happening. The other thing that we know about the short-term rental market is that there's about 20 to 30% year-on-year growth. I will say, as you guys probably saw earlier on, your numbers are a bit lower than that, but I think the one trend that we do see is that your market does continue to grow. And that we have seen over the last few years as we have sort of done different snapshots across Camden. So other highlights is just looking at trends across the board. So about 15x in growth in the number of short-term rental listings since 2011. Things to really keep in mind is that Airbnb, which is the largest platform overall, is publicly traded. So we've just gone through earnings seasons Q2. So you can go online and basically understand and see what's happening within the short-term rental market. It will really give you an idea of the trends within the marketplace and an understanding of where it is going in the future. So I always say within any of these meetings, do go online, do read their quarterly reports, do see their annual reports, because it will very much be reflective of what's happening within your marketplace. The other thing to keep in mind is that Airbnb is larger than all the hotel chains combined. So the Hiltons out there, the Marriotts, they don't even scratch the surface compared to an Airbnb, which is very much the juggernaut in the marketplace. So what is happening in Camden? So this is analysis that we did in August of 2023. What we identified is that there's about 398 short-term rental listings, which represents 339 unique rental units. The difference between a unique rental unit and a listing number, the unique rental unit is the actual physical property, so 123 Main Street. Each one of those physical properties has the ability to list on more than one site, and that's the reason why the listings number is higher. Things to point out about your map, just how colorful it is. So we can see these purple dots, you can see the red dots, you can see orange, you can see green. So what that's pointing to is the fact that people are listing on different platforms. It really does speak to just how dynamic this market is and how difficult it would be to try and track this market on your own, because it's not saying that everybody is listing on an Airbnb. Basically, they're listing across different platforms.
Samantha, could I just jump in real quick? I don't see, I'm assuming it's under other, but VRBO would be under other?
No, so basically, I can't quite recall if it's TripAdvisor or Expedia, but basically VRBO is owned by one of those parent companies. So
I'm guessing it's Expedia then, because there's so many of them. Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
basically what happened since sort of the heady days when I first became involved, the market was fragmented. So you had VRBO, Home Away, House Trip, like a plethora of other platforms. What's happened over time is as they've tried to catch up with Airbnb, they've purchased those platforms. And so what we've done here is wrapped them up into their parent company. The market, like the map would be so much more colorful if we didn't wrap it up. But basically it's wrapped up into the parent company. Okay. So I haven't gone into a huge amount of detail about the compliance tools, but in terms of how we actually go about capturing this data, what we do is we pull down the data from the top 70 plus short-term rental platforms. We match that with your assessor data. So that includes the physical address, owner's address, and parcel ID. All of the information is first matched by computer model, and then it's human verified. So we have a team of about 300 analysts, and what they do is go through and find 3 publicly available data sources to confirm that each one of those matches is correct. So all of the information and full-length screenshots are updated on the platform every 3 days. and we do data captures different times of day. So that way we know that we have a very robust data set in order to start driving information, and basically so that you can drive compliance once you have regulations, or even before regulations, so that you can start analyzing the market and understanding what's happening. Other analysis, median nightly rental rate, about $272 per night, mainly entire homes that are being rented out, mainly single family homes that are being rented out as well. The one thing that we always talk about around median nightly rental rate is just looking at setting fees and that fee setting structure. Generally, what we say is 2 to 3 times the median nightly rental rate, very much the cost of doing business. The other thing is that it allows for the program to pay for itself. Jeffrey will go into more detail about it, but the national average in terms of licensing fees is $250, or permitting fees is $250 per annum. But yeah, anything above that 2 to 3 times the median nightly rental rate really does allow for the system to pay for itself and for money to be put back into the community in order to fund this system. And then the final thing is just looking at those growth rates. So as we had spoken about before, in terms of looking at short-term rental listing growth, about 12%, really just speaking to the fact that it is becoming a more mature market. People are starting to list on more platforms. And so it really does speak to that dynamism of the short-term rental market. And then the final bit is just looking at that rental unit growth. So more people are actually transacting in this market. So 16% year-on-year rental unit growth as well. So sizable amount of growth. We have seen that trend over the last few years, and we would continue to expect it to grow. And you know, if you are planning on sort of creating caps, limiting primary residence requirement, those are the things that we would look at to sort of limit the growth, that growth trajectory over time.
Samantha, it's Ethan again. Can you just explain to me the defined rental unit growth as versus the short-term rental
Listing?
Yeah, what's the difference between the two slides you just showed? Like, what are we talking about as far as unique rental units versus the short-term rentals?
Yeah, so rental unit is the actual physical property. So when we say 16% year-on-year rental unit growth, that means 123 Main Street and 124 Main Street are now listed and like on the platforms, right? So 2 physical properties are on the platforms. When we say that the rental listing growth, what we're saying is 123 Main Street is now listing on Airbnb and VRBO. Right,
okay.
So they're listing on different platforms. So
Got
that's
it.
the distinction between the two.
Got it. Thank you.
Nice. So I'm about to turn over to Jeffrey. Any other questions for me about sort of the data and setting the scene for what's happening within Camden?
Well, I do have one more. Oops, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I just wanted to know, you mentioned 3 types of data that you match with our assessors. The owner's address, the physical address, and there was one other.
So just to step back. So basically, when we're doing the matching, basically what we do is we use the assessor's information and then match that with the information that we pull down from each one of the short-term rental platforms. So that's one step. And then basically what would happen, that would give us the physical address, owner's address, and parcel ID. So the assessor information, when it's matched with our information, that's how we get the details for each one of the owners. And then the second step is that we have a team of analysts and they go through and find 3 data sources. So whether it be like Zillow, Google Maps, any publicly available data sources to confirm that those matches are correct. So we've gotten the address, we've matched it with the assessor information, and then basically all of those details, we want to say, okay, we have the details, are they correct? So in order to substantiate each one of those matches, we'll find 3 data sources that confirm that that match is correct, right? So as I was saying before, whether it be property sales information that's publicly available or mapping information that's publicly available, basically we want to find 3 data sources to confirm each one of those matches is correct. So if you go out and you want to speak to somebody and say, you need to get licensed, you need to get registered, you just want to make sure that the information that you have is substantiated. And that's what we're doing from the outset. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you very much.
That does, and Jeannie anticipated my question. So just to be clear, I recognize that we haven't enlisted you yet to provide services to Camden, but if you did, you would provide those addresses to us.
Yeah, so basically the system is software as a service, so it continues to live, but the addresses are available, yes. So yeah, you get the addresses, we can send out letters on your behalf, get people registered, you can have a hotline. There's a slew of services that are available. So basically the system runs itself. It is fully holistic, yeah, in terms of how it would be run overall.
Great, thank you. Anyone else have questions for Samantha?
I do.
Yeah.
Hi, Samantha. Thank you for your presentation so far. I'm interested and will be as we continue the discussion, the idea of registrations and fees. And so you had a couple of slides, you don't have to go back to them, that talked about a $272 a night being a kind of typical reservation, and that a registration program often would start at $250 per year, or 2 to 3 times the rental rate. And could you expand on that a little bit to let us know what either you recommend or what other communities are doing to differentiate between the size of the rental? For example, a 1-bedroom in somebody's house versus a 4-bedroom home that nobody else is staying in. Is there a good way of distinguishing between the size of the rental unit?
So we do have customers that do differentiate. I think, to be honest, I'm going to turn over to Jeffrey, mainly because before we start talking about fees and permitting, he's going to talk about goals and goal setting and making sure that you're have a goal first. So I don't want to jump the gun and start talking about permittings and fees and what you should be charging. What I will say is, once you've had that system and put it in place, looked at the goals, looked at where you want to go, then sort of the next step is, okay, what are the fees that we want to put in place? But the first step is going to be doing that goal setting exercise, knowing what you're driving towards first, and then basically looking at your fee structure from there.
Thank you.
I'm not circumventing your question, but yeah, I just want to make sure that we do sort of don't jump the gun.
No, that's helpful.
I've put a bookmark on it here.
Yeah, John will definitely come back to it. Just to follow up on that, John, of course, you saw the slides and you see them now that we're looking at 80% is pretty much the whole home rental, and unit types, it's actually 90%. So rooms in someone's houses aren't really what we're looking at, in Camden. That's that one little sliver, unknown home type maybe, and there are some multifamily homes in there.
Good point, Ethan.
But yeah, so largely we're looking at whole homes and whole units. I had some other thought, but I'm sure it'll come back to me because I've lost it. But again, thanks so much, Samantha, for that. And go ahead, Jeffrey.
Well, I will mention that, there are a million ways to kill the cat, which is to say, I've seen, even on something as simple as a permit fee, you think there's only so many ways to do a permit fee. Pitkin County, Colorado, beautiful county, Colorado, they actually set your permit fee as a percentage of your assessed value.
Okay, right.
Right?
Right.
So they say, oh, you want to do short-term renting? Okay, well, pay us 0.014% of your assessed value, because they think that is to their vision. Because they're like, well, we've got mansions and we got trailers. We want to make sure that it's It's
Right,
fair.
sort of a sliding scale. Yep.
So-
So Jeffrey, real quick, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I did, since you're gonna be talking about goals, I'm just curious if Shenley and Jeremy shared with you our draft of the goals, if that's something that you've received or not.
I don't know if I received it. If you want to summarize it very quickly, since we're
Yeah, I think I
we're
could
here.
do it. I mean, off the top of my head, I mean, Shenley shared it around to us, and if we'd like, she could put it up for us. But we have been working on this for a while, even though we haven't taken a lot of, we haven't made much progress as far as actually coming up with an ordinance.
Sure.
And we did, as a town, put in a registration ordinance under the police power, and so that's not a zoning board or a planning board issue. And we found it's been about as effective as you might imagine.
Sure.
So there's very little teeth to it. So as a planning board, we have numerous goals, but we've sort of summarized them, and our town plan speaks very specifically to the available housing. We don't talk about affordable housing in Camden because there probably is none, but we do talk about
That's very
available
savvy
housing.
of you.
Yeah.
I'm glad you pointed that out. Yes.
Yeah, it's available housing stock for long-term rentals and or properties offered for sale in the town of Camden. And then, of course, another primary goal is ensuring the safety of STR occupants and the public. Then also to protect the town's sense of community and its desirability as both a renowned vacation destination and an attractive place to live and work. And protect the traditional practice of town residents offering their primary residences as seasonal vacation rentals themselves. That's something that's been long, held. Sometimes people in Camden will leave for 2 months and pay their mortgage for 3 years. Oh, Jeremy's putting it up there, I think now. Will pay their mortgage for 3 years or for a year or half the year by renting out for 3 months.
Yep.
And then finally, we also added in there, successfully address the current unequal playing field between our existing commercial lodging industry and unregulated short-term rentals.
Yep.
So those are sort of the main things that we had come up with. So we have put quite a bit of thought and effort into that, creating that document, and it's still a work in progress, obviously.
Yep.
I think the one that's there's varying levels of concern about each, but I think I don't think there's a person in the room who doesn't recognize the severity of the lack of affordable housing or available housing, and that has been kind of a main focus for us. Certainly, many people, we don't receive a lot of pushback on the safety issue, right? So that's a pretty standard. Most people agree that registration inspection, if we can cover the cost of it, makes sense. But anyway, I just wanted to get that out there before you start and then let you go ahead. So,
yeah,
thanks.
That's wonderful to hear. Again, I think a lot of times places they jump right into the weeds. They don't take the time to identify some of these big issues or what about those issues they want to deal with. It's a very useful document, and it's a very useful one to understand this issue in relationship to the broader community, right? This is not a siloed issue. This intersects with so many other things, whether that's housing, whether it's economic development, whether that's neighborhood character, health and safety, all these things. And so being able to relate it to other work that you've done, other expressions of the town's values, whether that's a master plan or a housing needs assessment or any of these other things, is really, really, really useful. And I've seen documents like that. Sometimes they are very narrative in a way that is illuminating, right? We worked with communities in Vermont where their statement of values about this issue was, we don't want a town where the only way you can have a house is either you're a millionaire or you inherit it. Right? That's their statement. And they say, we're going to follow through on that in all our land use decisions, including short-term rentals. And you go, okay, well, I understand where you're getting at. We've also seen communities, especially smaller communities, concerned about their school systems, that they're worried that without younger people moving in, that they won't have enough students to support their schools, or even from an economic development side, right? That they don't have places for the people who cook the food or clean the tables, or, let alone those, but also teachers, firefighters, we talked to one community where their veterinarian left town and there was just no way to replace them because it was so difficult to start a business and compete with some of the seasonal businesses. So again, there are some universal things. Everyone needs smoke detectors. Everyone's going to need a contact person who's going to pick up the phone if there's a problem. But those other nuances, especially around, in a place like yours that has that historic pattern of vacation rental use, and it's an important part of the character of the community. How do you make sure that doesn't run sort of get off the leash, right? How does it not just run out of control with these other things that are very valued, right? Neighborhoods, the sense that it's a real, a real community. It's not just tourists and then the rest 9 months of the year, it's the people on the Zoom call and no one else, right? I live in New Orleans. I didn't mention that, although I lived in New England for a number of years. New Orleans, that is the kind of existential discussion, and I think it actually resonates with a lot of communities, especially beach communities.
We're gonna get offline and talk housing swap after this.
Right. Anyway, so Samantha, I don't know if you want to share your screen again, and you can help me with some of the slides here. So like I said, I am Jeffrey Goodman. I've been doing planning on this. I think I started at the very basics. What is the short-term rental, right? And there's a million different names for it. There's a million different nuances to each one of those things. I do think we can think of lodging as a spectrum, right? From the proverbial little old lady who rents out her couch one day a year to a resort. Everything is on that spectrum. And what you're trying to do in an ordinance is draw some lines that divide up different types of short-term of lodging. And those lines are going to be where you're making sort of a value choice about what sort of market you're creating and how that's going to interact with the rest of your community. We work with some places that say, if you pay your taxes, you're golden, right? And we don't have a fire extinguisher and nothing else. We also work with places that say, you got to be a primary resident. That's how they're going to separate off a certain class of lodging from something else. Other places do it just by size, right? They'll say, if you're below, 2 or fewer bedrooms, you're in one category. If you're 3 or more, you're in another. Others places by zoning, by geographic distributions. There are a lot of different choices. I will say I read a lot of noir fiction. Flophouse is not a legal definition I see very often, but I included it anyway. If you want to go to the next slide. So I talk a little bit about a regulatory lens, right? So I think if you look at other ordinances, you look around the communities, even around you in Maine, but certainly throughout New England, there's every different way to go. And you see it even with communities that are very similar to yours or ones that are next door to each other. You need a kind of regulatory lens, which is how are you going to sort through all the possible directions you can go? And how are you going to justify the choices you ultimately make? When you say it's 3 bedrooms and not 2 bedrooms, or it's primary residence, but it's not primary residence. When the rubber meets the road, you're going to have some sort of tool. I'm mixing metaphors. You're going to have some way to choose from this great universe of regulatory levers. And I think that document that you just shared is working in that direction, right? Some of that is actually a prioritization. Obviously, you're not going to disregard health and safety or disregard historic patterns. But if you're going to have to choose between, say, housing availability and the historic pattern of vacation rentals, based on some lever you're trying to do, you're going to have to justify that, and you're going to have to keep making those justifications for every little detail you put in there. And if you don't have that strong lens, if you don't have that strong goal, if you don't even have that kind of prioritization, it's going to be really, really difficult because every possible idea is possible. So this is a really, really important point. And the question I always ask, which sounds like a very anodyne question, is what is success? In 1 year, in 3 years, in 5 years, what does a successful ordinance look like in your community? And I talked about kind of a narrative description of what that is, but I think it can be really useful as an exercise to be able to get at what are you really trying to see happen. And there's every possible answer. I mean, we've worked with communities that just say 100% of the short-term rentals pay us taxes. That is success. That's one 3-year and 5-year success. Other places say, you know, it has this effect on the housing market, or it opened up these opportunities, or our enforcement costs didn't continue to rise, or we didn't get any noise complaints, or any possible direction. But I think that's a really, really important point. And it's an important point to go back when you have that kind of goal document and think about, what does this add up to? What is it going to look like in 3 years, let's say, where you can turn around and say, we did it, right? We set out to do this and we did it. And it's probably not just people have permits. It's going to be something, I think, more evocative than that. So if you want to go to the next slide. Right. So how do you develop that lens? You're already, I think, on this path, right? So one is community input, which is, what's the view on the ground? You know, people feel very strongly about this issue because it impacts them very directly, and they've had experiences, positive, negative, neutral, whatever. And you want to be able to hear that and understand that, but recognize that that is the view from someone's lawn of what this issue is. Important to always remember that tourists don't vote. I just always point that out. You know, your duty is ultimately to the community. But you do want that on the ground, because that's also how I think a lot of times these ordinances are judged, which is, you might have something that's doing this work at a town-wide level, but if it doesn't stop the party next door from someone, they're going to feel like it was not a success. So that's an important piece of that. The second part, as Samantha pointed out, is that market data. What is the scope and scale of short-term rentals? You talk about affordability being a little bit off the table, which is true in a lot of places we work in. You know, you don't want to promise the moon. You don't want to say, yes, this is going to unlock 10,000 new units of housing in Canada. It's not that sort of scale of the issue. What sort of things can you learn from the location of them? What can you learn from the size of them? What can you learn? I think, as you pointed out, are they whole home or partial home? Are they single family units? Or are they not single family units? What is that price? So you need that data to be able to understand that market, and also perhaps even the reaction in the long-term rental market. And the third thing is really about your own expertise. So there are town-wide goals, longer-term goals, budgets, legal constraints from the state and from the county and from your local government that mean you can't do any possible thing. You have some ideas about where the town should be going over the course of 3 to 5 to 20 years, that an average person just off the street who's excited by this issue is not going to know, is not going to see, is maybe not even going to care about that much. So you need to be able to bring that expertise to bear. And also the budget is always a big piece. You know, I clown on South Lake Tahoe all the time. It's a lovely place out in California, but they had an element in their short-term rental ordinance that said you could be in a hot tub after 10 p.m., but you couldn't run the jets of the hot tub after 10 p.m. And I don't think they have established the budget to enforce that type of rule. And that just leads to a lot of frustration, because there is someone who would call in at 10:05 to say the hot tub jets are on, right? So establishing those types of expectations is really important. And a lot of that comes from talking about what the budget says, talking what you're legally allowed to do. So I talked about that kind of spectrum of lodging. Here are the most common sorting mechanisms, let's call them, and even kind of sub spectrums within that spectrum that a lot of communities use to try to divide up lodging into coherent categories that are distinct, that achieve certain elements of their goal, right? So the type of property, the number of bedrooms, the frequency of use, whether it's owned by a renter or all the way to a real estate investment trust. Is it someone's primary residency? What type of zoning is it allowed in or not allowed in? Do you even want to go towards commercial style safety features, which in some places legally they have to have sprinklers and second exits and all those things? Certain types of limitations or emphasis on the rental type, whether you only allow sort of full homes, whether it can only be a hosted rental, which means the owner is on site at all times. And then certainly how permitting works. So we've seen some places just do everything's as a right. Other places have, conditional permitting for all their vacation rentals, right? Everyone has to come up and give their little talk and have public comment, right? It's a slow system, but it ensures a lot of control. So you have a lot of different ways to split up what we call short-term rentals, or what, that sort of big pile of lodging. You have to choose ones that are meaningful to your built environment, meaningful to that broader goal that you've established. So these are the ones, though, that we see most often. So big question I was going to ask, what's a good ordinance to look at? Well, you certainly should look at the ordinances of some of the towns around you. There are a lot of very interesting ones that we've talked to with interesting systems. But I think something to keep in mind when you read through those are, what are those towns' goals? You look at Kennebunkport. Kennebunkport has a very clear goal about how they have set up their system. They have a very unique system of caps. Also think about what their budgets are, what their housing market differences are, perhaps even their kind of politics, although everyone loves local politics, and just their general context. So it's an important thing.
Sorry, can I just jump in again?
Yeah.
And again, we did actually do quite a bit of this as well. Pat, I can let you speak to it, but I know you drove the effort. But we did look at towns like Kennebunk and Bar Harbor. I think we added in South Portland. We had I'm spacing on the others. Yeah, Cape Elizabeth was another one that we looked at pretty significantly. Anyway, Pat, do you want to just jump in and talk about your efforts? And I know that we did follow up with the some of the local officials to try to find out how their experience has been also.
Well, we basically aggregated the data into spreadsheets, and so we could view it that way, which seemed helpful. And a lot of feedback we seemed to get was to try to keep it as simple as you can. Try to involve the community. I think that was Rockland's suggestion, to whatever degree you're able to. And but I think just being able to look at it at a view within the spreadsheet was quite helpful.
Yeah, it is useful, especially, even on very, very simple things. I mean, talk about fees and fines, right? You lay out, oh, this is what Kennebunkport is charging. This is what Newport, Rhode Island is charging. This is what, all the way down anywhere in the coast, let alone anywhere in Maine. And you go, okay, we can see a trend and we see the outliers. And you go, oh, this one town that's charging $50, they're kind of getting left behind by all the places that are, I think Newport, Rhode Island, the most expensive permit's $1,000, something like that. So, but also you start to see trends, right? And I think you see trends, and even smaller trends within when those ordinances were passed, right? I think we've seen anecdotally, just from talking around the country, issues emerge, and there's no kind of national group pushing things, but just more sophistication from local governments about what they're trying to achieve on something like housing, what they're trying to achieve in a very nuanced way about commercial style operation. Whereas when we started, into 2017, 2018, everything was we just need people to get registered. Like, we just need any system in place. And I think the ordinances that have been passed, especially coming out of COVID, have gotten a little bit more sophisticated, which has been really good to see. I always joke that that's those sections of ordinances that I think often we kind of glaze over as we read them, those whereases. They tell you a lot about how this ordinance came to be, right? They tell you the goals. They tell you often they have sort of little hints of maybe some of the battles that they've had. And it can be really important to be able to see that and be able to understand, okay, this is what their stated goal is. Are they even achieving that, right? We've seen so many ordinances where the the whereases, the justifications, the purposes are all about housing. And then you look at the actual meat of the ordinance and there's nothing about housing at all, right? And so you see sometimes even those disconnects where they haven't followed through on something, or they had to give lip service to something, or who knows what, or someone came in at the last moment and tinkered with it. So it is really, really useful to get into some of those things. So it's good to hear that you guys have been able to do that and glean something from it. Spreadsheets, everyone loves a spreadsheet.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Oh, just a quick question. I mean, are you studying, like, I guess now that this has been more advanced, are you doing any trends or studies about different municipalities and cities that do something so far as to even ban them? Like, I think New York did something radical recently.
Yeah.
Do you all see any kind of impacts or things that have happened as a result of these, major regulations?
Yeah, so New York's rules are interesting. The rules that they are started to enforce were rules they pretty much had on their books, but had never enforced, which is that it was a limit to 2 bedrooms. It had to be your primary residence. You had to be on site. Well, if you're some slick Manhattan real estate guy, you've had 45 properties. You don't live in 45 properties. And so that's why you've seen some huge changes. I think Airbnb reclassified 20,000 short-term rentals in a day this week because those rules came into play. We've seen, I think, some interesting things about some research that's been done on housing specifically, and the housing slide happens to be up. We have looked at some of the research that's been done on cities that went from legal short-term rentals and then moved to primary residency, and what the effects on housing prices were, which is they had a negative effect on housing prices, which was viewed positively by housing advocates. Same thing with long-term rents. Also, just often the biggest thing is about sort of the changes in really the pace of change, right? So we just wrapped up a project for San Bernardino County, all the way in California, huge county, but they have places like Joshua Tree, Big Bear Lake, these very prominent destinations. The issue there wasn't that there was short-term rental activity, because a lot of those places have had short-term rentals for generations. It's that, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, the pace of change increased so rapidly that it was very disruptive to their housing market. That literally every house that was coming onto the market was immediately being flipped into a short-term rental. And that was displacing a lot of long-term residents. And so we were able to quantify how many of those units were shifting, and what were some of the price points of them, what those differences were. So there's a lot going on, and as you might expect, again, and housing is complicated, and so anytime you're talking about homes, you're going to get a lot of different kinds of issues occurring nationally. One of the difficult things is a lot of the research, the real academic research, has been done in places like New York and San Francisco and Vancouver and London, which is good, but it's hard to translate, things that have been done in London to Camden, Maine, or even mid-sized cities. So that's I think a really emerging place where we're trying to support a little bit more research, is trying to say what is happening in smaller towns or even rural areas, because we work with a lot of rural counties, when some of these changes go into effect. And we think it's actually probably easier to measure. There's a lot of factors going on in the pricing of lower Manhattan. I think it's probably easier to measure in some of these rural places or in the smaller cities. Right. So that's emerging. And then obviously the pandemic, the numbers get all wonky. But,
right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I do want to talk about housing issues because I know it is a priority, which is this issue is the industry itself is professionalizing. I know it's been a profession of sorts in your town for a while, but we're talking about more commercial style investment, LLC ownership as opposed to even trust ownership. You know, obviously the gap between long-term rents and short-term rental income is very determinative about what people choose to do their property, what they choose to do with their property. Often the most expensive neighborhoods are not where you have the most housing pressure because they are expensive to buy into. You know, we often see neighborhoods that are, you know, workforce housing even. We've even seen some places trailer parks, because if you are looking to do an investment, that's where housing is relatively less expensive, and so your potential returns are greater. And an important thing whenever we're talking about housing and short-term rentals is it's always easier to protect units than to try to roll back flips from long-term to short-term renting. The cost of doing that is very high. Sedona, Arizona, Summit County, Colorado have whole institutions in place to try to pay homeowners to flip their units or to make their units available to seasonal workers or to long-term tenants. Those are very, very, very expensive programs. I think Sedona's budget was $1.3 million in subsidies, something like that, to get 50 non-permanent units of affordable housing. I don't think that's personally, I don't think that's a good investment, but there are ways to try to keep units from being flipped to being a short-term rental, or to make homeowners reconsider how they use it seasonally even. They can make more units available. In your case, maybe not as affordable housing, but even just as home ownership opportunities for people who want to be year-round residents.
Right, and
of the town.
that's our key thing there, Jeffrey. And can you just explain again what like you referred to in Sedona? They're putting all the money. What are they doing with their money, and why is that?
So what their big issue is that gap between short-term rental income and long-term rents is huge, right? Because you have a lot of, and then the amount of money you can get from short-term renting is very big. So what they have is a program where they pay a homeowner who normally would have a short-term rental. They pay the difference between that long-term rent and the short-term rental income potential to make it a long-term rental for that year. And the issue is that gap is very big. And so
here too. Yeah.
Right. And so that subsidy is quite large. And so, like I said, their budget is $1.3 million, but $1.3 million only nets you 50 or 70 units because that subsidy per each unit has to be so big.
And why did they feel compelled to do that?
They felt compelled to do that because they didn't, well, in Arizona specifically, they had state preemptions. They were actually not able to have a local law that would change the definition of what a short-term rental could be. Now they don't have preemption, but they are unwilling, I would think, to change the definition of what a short-term rental unit is or to install a cap. And so because of that, the free market has taken their housing in the direction that is most lucrative for those homeowners. And if they want to provide affordable housing, either the local government needs to build it, basically, or they need to subsidize it. And that is very expensive. And so that's I think, we talk about political will. That I think is one of those things that is very difficult there. Is the idea of a cap has been, until I think pretty recently, totally off the table. Well, if there's no cap, then you don't have a lot of leverage to take any of those units and make them anything but a short-term rental because the demand is so high. So that's what they did, and that I don't view it as a very successful use of money. But they for a long time didn't have a lot of choices but to offer direct subsidies because they couldn't rein in their local short-term rental market.
Got it. Thank you. That's very helpful.
Yeah.
Could I ask what role lawsuits play in unwillingness to change short-term rental regulations?
Sure. New Orleans is now facing, I think its third lawsuit, something about like that. Well, you know, someone will always try to sue, I think, kind of no matter any kind of change, right? And I think it spooks a lot of towns because, you know, they don't have a legal challenges are expensive and can be difficult. I think it also is a little unnerving for local governments because of those goal setting questions. You know, if they're not very confident that they have their ordinance tight and it's all working towards the same thing, it's sometimes harder to justify on a line by line basis what they're doing. The only times lawsuits really become that successful, I think, is if you have given someone a right and you're trying to roll it back. So we see this often in places that have a zoning change on a property that allows them to do short-term renting, and then a attempt to sort of invalidate that. Often those properties end up being grandfathered into some new system. We have seen challenges around primary residency, but only here in the Fifth Circuit, which is Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Most other courts in the nation will not, I think, rule the same way that the Fifth Circuit did in terms of primary residency, just because I don't think they'll take that position. The other difficulty, I think, is often around caps in what sort of system are you using to give out licenses or give out permits. You know, are you basing up a lottery or a first come first serve system in a way that is consistent with state law often. You always, of course, have people who just say, I was able to do something and now I can't do it, even if it was illegal. And so I'm going to sue because this is a taking of my property and my property's rights. Those types of lawsuits have not been particularly successful unless there is something like there's been some sort of zoning change or there's been some sort of other right granted that they can hold up and say, I was allowed to do this, or that I had the expectation to be able to continue that indefinitely. Yeah.
That's helpful. Thank you, Jeffrey.
Sure.
Good
So
question, Jeannie.
yeah, please. And
Or Shenley.
so I want to talk very briefly about enforcement. And this is, I think, the best practice we've seen in terms of how to structure enforcement, which is separating out what I call major violations, which are more licensing violations, operating without a license, operating outside the scope of your license, not paying your taxes. Those sorts of things, to me, are major violations that are more objective than quality of life violations, which I say are minor violations. They're not minor to the people that they affect, but quality of life violations tend to be a little bit more subjective in terms of how you measure noise or when, you know, some of the data on that is captured. For major violations, to me, those are where you really bring out your hammers. You know, I always use the example, which is if I started a bar in my garage and the alcohol control board caught me, they wouldn't go, well, if we catch you 2 more times in this year, then you'll face some sort of real penalty. No, you're shut down, right? It's over. And I think that's a good way to drive compliance in your system, is to make those major violations really where you use your powers to the maximum effect, to make sure that everyone comes in from the cold, make sure everyone is signed on to a license or a permit where they have to abide by certain types of regulations, certain codes of conduct. Minor violations are more about how the property is used. The thing there is to look for patterns, right? If people get a citation for noise or trash, then do they change how they operate? Are they vetting their guests better? Are they installing their own noise monitors to try to get ahead of things? Once you establish a pattern that they're just not violating, they're not doing right by the community, that's where you start invoking some of the higher penalties. And we've seen places that say if you get a certain number of quality of life violations, you know, your property cannot be a short-term rental for 1 year. In some places I've seen in Minnesota, I've seen a place that does 7 years, right? So really trying to have some teeth beyond just those little, you know, sometimes those little fines. In a place like yours, not being able to operate legally as a short-term rental is probably a bigger deal than just any of the fining powers you have. That the loss of income from a season is probably more than you can normally fine on a lot of things. So certainly being able to push that to the limit, especially at the onset of a program, is going to drive compliance. It's going to make sure that your roles and the market itself are in alignment. You don't have people who say, basically, I'm going to operate till someone catches me. That's you want people to really at the beginning come in and be part of your system as quickly as possible. And then I do want to just talk very briefly about emerging issues, because I know we're running through time, which is obviously tax collection and auditability. Lots of places have deals with the platforms that the platforms will do tax collection. There have been some issues about whether the platforms are collecting those taxes correctly and remitting those taxes correctly. Hilton Head, South Carolina, sued Airbnb and VRBO because they didn't think they were getting the right amount. So I'm a big believer in any system you have has to be auditable. It has to be transparent. It can't be a black box of just kind of trust me. A big one is also about assessment. So when you have short-term rentals and long-term rentals or homeowner properties mixed together, how is assessment being done? Because we have seen some places that have said we need to actually assess them at different levels, because it's not fair to a full-time resident that their property is being assessed based on the comps, based on the sales of properties that are short-term rentals or vacation rentals, that those are different markets and they should be assessed differently. Sometimes that runs into state law. And another one that is really emergent that we had not seen really until last year and a half, are infrastructure and environmental issues. So lots of questions about wastewater, about utility usage, about infrastructure, that no one talked about. We now have seen a few communities actually do studies. How much more wastewater is a vacation rental producing than a long-term building? The town of Bell in Wisconsin, which is on Lake Superior, actually monitored everyone's septic system. It's a very tiny town. And they were able to say that during the season, vacation rentals produce 1.5, 1.75 times as much wastewater as a regular home, which makes sense. My home is a 3-bedroom home. It has 2 adults in it and a toddler. A vacation rental 3-bedroom might have 6 or 8 adults in it, all showering, all cooking, all doing laundry. The effect on that infrastructure, whether it's on septic or on even the town's infrastructure, is that emerging issue that we've seen some places start to say, we're going to limit occupancy by septic system size or by your well size or any sort of other infrastructure factors. So that's one that I've learned way too much about septic systems, more than I ever wanted to. But it's one that no one was talking about probably 2 years ago, or very few people were talking about. But in communities that have water issues or water quality concerns, it's one that I think is really important to consider.
Just before Jeffrey moves on, the one thing that I did want to interject and say, just around that analysis and looking at infrastructure and environment, Granicus and host compliance, we actually have we can integrate with your GIS system, so Esri. And so one of the things that becomes really useful there is as you're doing analysis and looking at sort of feature layers. So as Jeffrey was talking about before, looking at the infrastructure, then you can basically start analyzing the data by sort of mapping over what do you see in your GIS system, and then looking at the STRs that we have as well. So it really starts to dig deeper in terms of analyzing some of the data and understanding what the impact is to Camden overall.
And so I just have one more slide, which is avoid these common mistakes. And you're already on these paths. So it's very, very good to hear. Again, having that lens, having some sort of goal in mind is going to make it a lot easier to choose from all the possible ways you can go. Again, treating lodging holistically. What is a short-term rental? How is it different than a bed and breakfast? How is it different from other kinds of short-term rentals or other kinds of lodging? Do those divisions make sense? Are they working towards the goal that we want them to work for? And another one is just communication. It's brought up with Rockland. communicating expectations about what this will do to the housing market, what this will do for people's lived experiences. You know, having any kind of vacation rental means that there might be a loud noise, there might be trash or parking. You know, what does this mean for the budget? All these things, if you're open about them, the goal I always say is not to make everyone happy, because if you want to make everyone happy, you're in the wrong profession. The goal is that everyone understands why the rules are the way they are. And if they disagree with it, they can elect a council, they can go to town meeting, they can do all these other things to change it. But what you don't want is for people to feel like they weren't heard, and that your ordinance is kind of just a big pile. You want something that people really understand the rationale behind. And we've seen places where you get grumbling, you get threats of lawsuits, maybe even see a lawsuit or two, but ultimately those places are the most successful because their ordinance is pulling in the direction of their town values and the vision they want to see. So I think you're actually, certainly relative to a lot of the places we talk to, really farther down that path than you think. And I think you're really moving in the right direction in terms of how to frame this issue and how to make sure that it is communicating the values of your town. So it's very good to see. So that's my presentation. That's my little bit. I'm becoming increasingly darker and blurrier. I'm sorry.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey. That was really enlightening. And I saw a couple of hands pop up. Samantha, did you want to jump in before we ask questions, or you all set? Okay. So yeah, I'll go with Pat, then John, and if anybody else had questions, just give me a nod, and I'll put you on the list here. So go ahead, Pat, first.
I had two questions. The first one was, I read about some places that had put out a year moratorium on their short-term rentals. I wasn't totally sure what that did in the long term for long-term rentals.
Yeah, so a lot of places do that when they are drafting regulations, because they want to create this gap so that you don't have people who will rush in to try to get it under the old system, or try to read the tea leaves and put in certain types of investments. So you do see some moratoriums where it's just, we're going to hold everything steady. We're not going to issue new permits. In some cases, it's a moratorium and attrition, where they say we're not going to issue new permits, and permits that expire just expire, and a new system is coming. Often places, the difficulty with moratoriums is you still need to enforce them. So there are a lot of places where you do a moratorium, but people go, by the time something else comes around, like they won't have caught me, right? So I'm just going to kind of keep doing what I'm doing, and then there'll be a new system, and I'll register under that. 1 year is probably not enough to shift the long-term market, unless people believe that what's coming is apocalyptic, right? You know, if you think, oh, there's going to still be legal vacation rentals in a year, you know, I'll wait it out. It's not a huge deal. So often, though, you do see it as a way to create a gap between an old system and a new system, to often make sure all permits expire. I've seen that's really common, to say we're going to actually have a gap long enough that permits all expire, so that everyone has to be under the new system. They cannot claim to be under the old system. But often it's just to buy time to go through the public process and to create new rules. Yeah.
I see. Okay. The second one of our board members had asked about if ordinances take place that ultimately ban a certain type of short-term rental, how easily, or I guess maybe what's your experience been in these situations for turning those short-term rentals into long-term rentals?
Yeah, so it's really dependent on your housing market. So, you know, I'll give you an example very local to me, the French Quarter. French Quarter, obviously a very big tourism destination. They, in the last ordinance, had a ban on short-term rentals within the French Quarter. And part of that was to help the hotels. Part of that is just, French Quarter is always treated very differently. The question was, what happens to those units? And in a place like the French Quarter, a lot of them never converted to being available to as long-term units because the people who own them were so wealthy, and were already treating them as pied-à-terres or seasonal rentals for Mardi Gras, that they go, okay, well, we can't make short-term rental money. It's just going to sit empty, right?
But
And
what
so,
about, what about an example, where they could turn into long-term rentals, where the owners aren't that wealthy or something like that?
yeah, so if you have something like that, then it forces those owners to make a choice, and they can often they could live in the property, they could sell it, they could rent it long term, they could convert it into a commercial operation, I suppose, or it could sit vacant, right? And so ultimately, the choice that they make depends a little bit on the property, because some properties are just not going to become long-term rentals for any number of reasons, or they're going to choose one of those things. And it depends on what long-term rents are. It depends on the expectations of those owners. So what I'm saying is it's difficult to say, yes, it's definitely going to lead to X number of units converting. I never want to promise that. I do think that if you had any kind of limitation, it's going to force people to make those choices. And I think you guys know, or you guys would be able to think about who will, or what type of units are most likely to make a choice towards long-term renting or to long-term home ownership. That's, I think, one that's a little bit unexplored, is if you're a person who wants to move there, you're competing currently with vacation rentals and the vacation rental industry in terms of what you can offer. So we have seen places that institute those types of changes and see certain types of properties values or sales prices drop relative to everywhere else, because you're not paying that premium that's available to people who can make the pretty high amount of money from the tourism industry. So you'll see a lot of different dynamics going on, and I think a lot of that depends on the real estate market and the types of properties you have.
Okay, thanks.
Could I follow up on Pat's question by asking if fines for empty houses impact the conversion, make it happen more rapidly?
Yeah, I think so. They're pretty small subset of places that have those types of specific vacancy taxes. Often what you see is the kind of inverse, which is everyone's taxes go up, but then there's like a huge homestead exemption, right? Often that's a little bit more palatable politically. I think, again, if you're operating a short-term rental, you have a spreadsheet. You know what money you need to make to justify a certain price, your own mortgage, whatever it is. Anything that upsets that is going to force a reaction. And depending on what those types of taxes are relative to the incomes, you're going to get a bigger or smaller reaction. There are always going to be some people, like I said, who are wealthy enough to absorb it. Or you do have some properties that say, oh, this is actually a really good inducement, right? It's the opposite of Sedona, right? You're not subsidizing them, you're penalizing them for making a different choice. And so I do think it can be a useful tool. It's not very common, but I think it's going to become more, especially in places where you have this type of seasonality to your market. Yeah. Ethan, I think you're on mute.
I seen you're muted.
Yeah, I'm a mutant too, but I think John had his hand up a while back, so I wanted to make sure I got him into the conversation. And then if anybody else wants to chime in.
Thanks, Ethan. I have a question about maybe some mechanics here. but maybe it's larger. Airbnb and VRBO seem to be the big players in this market. And, I had read of other communities that require a business license for short-term rentals, and then they work with Airbnb in particular, who will not list a short-term rental unit unless they have a business license number. So with that as an example, can we look at those two big national firms as allies with us, or can we consider them a supporter in specifics like that?
So I will be very direct about that. Airbnb and all the platforms, but specifically Airbnb and VRBO, have not been friends to local governments. They have, for a variety of reasons and in a variety of places, tried to play nice or put on a nice face, but in the details, they have been very difficult for local governments to work with in the way that local governments would like. They've been great for the way the platforms would like. Even details like you're talking about, which you do have a number of cities are require that they have a business license section that you type in your thing. Airbnb doesn't, except in some places that have really gone to the maths, Airbnb doesn't check those. It's up to you to say, hey, this one's wrong. And they go, oh, okay. And then maybe they do something about it. And so you have tons of places, in New Orleans, again, I'll use New Orleans as a great example, where people just write pending, just pending, right? And that goes through and they accept reservations. It's a thunderstorm. I'm not being dramatic here. And so they just have not been very good partners. And I wouldn't trust them to, because they don't have a lot of financial incentive to help you. They have a lot of financial incentive to not help you, or not be timely, or to drag their feet, or to make it difficult to talk to them. So you have seen some places that have gotten concessions from the platforms to do certain things. Oftentimes that requires licensing the platforms themselves as as short-term rental platforms. They get a business license just like anyone else. But they don't have a great track record, I guess is what I'm saying. And I just don't trust them to do what they say they do. And they kind of rely on the fact that a lot of local governments are not going to pay their counsel to go sue a company that's based in the clouds to make them do things, to be real direct about it. These are, as Samantha mentioned, I think Airbnb's value is $47 billion. They answer a little bit to New York. They answer to Amsterdam and to London. They really have not put in a lot of bespoke things for smaller governments. So that's not to say you can't do it, but I think it's a hard row to hoe to get the things that you want out of them. Yeah.
Thank you for that discouraging.
To add to
Go
what
ahead.
Jeffrey was saying, just to remember as well that they are there for their shareholders, right? So one of the things that we talked about earlier on is the fact that they have had their IPO, they are a publicly traded company. So it's, again, not like good business practice to start shutting down parts of your business. So I know when I first started, and we have seen it across different communities as well, where when new legislation is created, they do advertise to the community to say that this new legislation is coming out, come out in force. So that way the legislation doesn't go through. So we do see that in a lot of different communities as well. The other thing is too, that because you guys are smaller, generally what we'll see is, as Jeffrey alluded to before, bigger places. I don't know of any small community that has agreements directly with Airbnb. The only one that I can think of for tax purposes is Ithaca, New York, that I know has an Airbnb agreement, but it's few and far between. I haven't seen smaller communities that do have those agreements in place en masse.
Yeah, I think
Go ahead. I'll let you both finish. I'm going to jump in, Pat, and then you can jump in. Okay.
Okay, yep, sure.
Oh yeah, so I think a way that you could start to look at that is a little bit through advocacy, maybe at the state level. We have seen some places to advocate on the state level for the state government to kind of be the big dog and work as opposed to every individual city try to create certain deals. Often that does come with the state taking over a lot of hotel taxing, which they get their little cut, of course. But often the state government maybe has a better ability to kind of be on equal footing than often local governments
Yeah,
do.
and that's what I wanted to sort of springboard off of is Maine does collect taxes through Airbnb. At least I know that much. I don't know about the other platform. I'm pretty sure that VRBO probably does. But I think that's a great idea, Jeffrey, when you speak to that, because I know that the Maine Municipal Association is really looking at this issue, and they might be the type of group that could help advocate for the municipalities to sort of, leverage the larger groups to collect local taxes as well. But state taxes are collected on the platforms. At least the ones that are, known and approved, that kind of thing. And so, but that is a great question, John, and it's something to think about. And Pat, go ahead.
Well, and very, very briefly related to that is like I said, that auditability in places that have those types of tax agreements. Often it's, you won a golf tournament, you get a giant novelty check. I think there are some places that are trying to push to get unit by unit numbers for how much money did they collect and how much tax they get paid and how much was remitted, and really give you that full picture, which Airbnb is resisted in a lot of other jurisdictions where they just kind of say, here's a bunch of money, don't ask any questions about it, about where did it come from. So I think that's another one for the League of Cities or for the municipal associations to push on, which is there are not a lot of businesses that allow you to just kind of do a trust me on taxes. Maybe that's a way to revamp that, is to get that kind of information, which, if nothing else, would allow you to do retroactive enforcement of any units that collected money that shouldn't have collected money. But it also puts a lot of pressure on people not to violate those rules, because they know that if they book anything, it's going to show up with those remittances. So that's another point I think to emphasize if you run into anyone from those municipal leagues.
When you guys were talking about how Airbnb and VRBO don't work well at all in a lot of cases with local governments, is one of the aspects you're covering, I thought one of the things I had read about, you can get a feed where it sounded like Airbnb had some type of hook into your local town system that allowed them to make sure that they actually had a license number and were registered.
Yep.
It's
their city portal, I believe is what they call it.
Is that what you were referring to when you were saying they don't work well with local governments, or is that one of the areas you were talking about?
Yeah, so that's pretty recent. Samantha, I don't remember. They started their city portal 2 years ago.
I think so, yeah. It's
Something
about
like
2020, 2021.
Well, before that, it was just data agreements, and they would send data to places like New Orleans or to Portland or San Francisco, but it was anonymous. It just had a string of numbers, and then paid $4,000 or something, and it was up to the city then to subpoena Airbnb to identify, oh, we want the full information on these 1,000 properties that we think are illegal. And then Airbnb would have 30 days to give that information up, and then the city could act on it. So that's a really slow, inefficient system. And I worry that the city portal is just a kind of recapitulation of that, where the cities or the towns still need to identify to the company that something is wrong, and then the company does something, rather than the actual proactive point, which is what we would all like them to do, which is they actually verify, the platforms verify before a listing is created, let alone booked. I don't think, ever really done that, certainly not of their own accord, definitely not on their own accord. They have done something like that in a few very large cities where they were legally forced to do that, where they got licensed, or they signed a specific agreement with the city of Los Angeles, which is a place that we work with, to do certain types of enforcement actions on their part. And so that's why I say they just haven't been good partners, because a good partner would recognize what the other one wants to achieve and work towards that. They drag their feet. They have their press releases, but they really drag their feet in the details to make it difficult for local governments to do what they want to do. So that's what I mean by that.
Okay.
Lucia, I saw you sort of semi-raising your hand. Are you ready to jump into the fray?
Yeah, and I apologize. As happens in the business, at the wrong time, I had to check in a guest. So,
Yep.
Anyway, that's what happens in the B&B business. But I had a quick question. One of my questions was answered with the answer to John's question, but and forgive me if you all went through this and I didn't catch it before I was able to log on. But my question is, do you have any good examples or of incentivizing registration?
Yeah, so sometimes there's negative incentives, right? So the threats of certain things happening are motivating in a lot of cases. A lot of it is about outreach, really making sure that no one can claim that they didn't know they had to do something. No one, and that's true for hosts, it's true for guests, it's true for neighbors. Like, people need to know what the expectations are, and then if they don't meet those expectations, there are consequences. Places that have had a lot of success do make it clear that there are, what you're supposed to do with your trash can, or when you're supposed to be noisy, or how many people you're supposed to have, or if you're supposed to have a wedding or not have a wedding in a building, those sorts of things. In terms of registrations, unless there are penalties and people perceive that they might experience those penalties, there's not a lot of drive often to register. I mean, that doesn't mean those people are bad people, but they make a choice that I think is understandable in its own way. So if there aren't penalties, or there aren't the perception that your number might come up, people really let it ride, because it's easier to not do something than to do it. Especially if doing something means you actually have to do something, you're subject to other types of penalties, you're supposed to pay your taxes in a certain way, whatever it is. So often we see it really takes those negative penalties, and sometimes it's a little bit of a kind of outreach. So West Hollywood moved to a much more penalizing system, and one of the first things they did is they went after a property they knew they could have a really big splashy fine about. So they had a property, it was a real problem property, that they fined $50,000, something like that, and they tipped it to their own local newspaper. So it was front page of the paper. It says, illegal short-term rental faces $50,000 fine. Well, wouldn't you know it, that week people started to come out of the woodwork and filing their permit fees, right? So it's unfortunate that you need those kinds of negative things to drive registrations, but absent that, it is really difficult to get people to act often outside their own interest. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a great point. We've talked about that at length too, about needing an ordinance with teeth, and also making sure that it covers our costs and our expenses on our end. One of the questions I had for either of you, with as far as what your thoughts are. So we've looked a lot at the varying types of rentals. We do have this sort of local economy of some vacation rentals, and we are not sure how to quite work that in. But we have focused a lot on non-primary, what we call non-primary unhosted short-term rentals. And the definition for us is that basically something along the lines that the person is not receiving the homestead exemption, which means they're not living here more than 50% of the year, 50% plus 1 day. And those, trying to get those properties, we feel, and we've had some pushback from people in the business, and they're saying, well, that's 95% of the rentals in town. And the answer is, like, you just answered your own question, or my question, right? I mean, that's why it's a problem. But we have looked at some, we've talked about an outright ban on those properties. We've talked about capping it to a percentage, like some other communities do, of the available housing stock. And we've talked about capping it to a certain number of days. And just throwing a number out there that we've used at random was 42, which is, as you know, 6 weeks. What are those? How do you look at those three options when it comes to something? Not only as far as like efficacy, but also community pushback and other things like that. I mean, we understand that if we take a drastic measure like banning non-primary unhosted, that's probably a lawsuit.
It's good. You're going to get more pushback, right? So I'll start.
So who knows?
Yeah. So I'll start.
Thanks.
Day limits, very, very difficult to enforce. Just because you need to track it. The hosts are not going to track it for you. They have no incentive, absolutely no incentive to do it. And if they're on multiple platforms, it gets even more complicated. The other thing is, it's very difficult to, unless they go way, way, way over, have that level of proof where you can go into a court and say they're at 43 days and not 41 days, right? Because you're going to have to do that. And so we haven't seen a lot of places have success with day limits. Partly just it's bad bang for your buck. It's just a lot of work, and it is not a great way to often segment the market efficiently.
Okay, can I just jump in there? Just having been a user of Airbnb, I mean, I can go on and see a property and whether or not it's available. Right. And so,
but available is not rented.
Right. Doesn't mean it's absolutely rented. I understand that. Right. And so that's what I'm sort of wondering. So Granicus doesn't have a function, or they're not able to get the data from Airbnb or VRBO that shows these are actual rentals. They're just days that it's unavailable.
We have, I mean, Samantha could explain it way better than me. Let's go ahead.
So we have a tool called rental activity monitoring, and basically what it does is it looks at the amount of activity that could be happening in each one of those short-term rentals. So basically we have a minimum, medium, and a maximum amount of activity or revenue that's been generated from each one of those short-term rentals. The thing is that, again, as Jeffrey was saying, it becomes really onerous, because what you're saying then is you want to identify short-term rentals that have been active in the market. We can flag those ones that we think have had the amount of activity, whatever your cap is. But then what you're going to have to do is then ask those people to download their activity from each one of the short-term rental platforms, upload it into our platform to substantiate that activity has happened. And so again, it just becomes really onerous. So we
onerous on you, or on the person participating in the short-term rental market?
Both. So,
okay.
again, enforceability. So, you want to have regulations that you are driving through to your goal, but is there a better way to get there, right?
Yeah.
So again, you can flag those people, you'll be able to substantiate that they've either had the right amount of activity or that they haven't, but somebody has to do that, right? And so even if we are uploading that information, it means somebody has to check it, somebody has to substantiate it, and you're going to have to keep on going through that process. The other thing is too, is again, if they reach 41 days versus 42 days, then you're going to have to do that again and again and again and again, year after year after year. So it just becomes a lot for different communities. And the one thing I would say in Long Island, New York, again, we see those caps, but it just becomes very difficult to start managing it. So is it the best use of anybody's time? No, there are better ways to be able to limit activity in short-term rentals for sure.
That's really helpful. And one of the things that we had talked about was adding teeth to the sort of supposing they submit an affidavit saying I have rented for less than 43 days, right? And then if there's some and the penalty is you falsify that affidavit, you lose the right to rent short-term in our community for 7 years.
Right? I mean, you can do it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a system that we do see. It's not illegal to put that system in place. It's a very, very, I think it's just a very complicated one, and I don't think it gets. It's complicated, which means there's more loopholes, which means there's more ways to wiggle around it. There's more ways to sort of juke and jive through some of these little things. Maybe you don't upload all your data. Maybe you don't upload it correctly. Maybe you do all that. I mean, it just is complicated. And
yeah, and I get that. I totally get that. So that's why I'm coming to you with this idea, because part of what we're looking at is, as we've mentioned, is we have this sort of history. And I see Crystal, your hand up. I just saw that. We have this sort of history of, as we said, sort of vacation summer rentals for people who actually do own or live in the properties. And it's really hard to carve out an exception for somebody who wants to rent their camp on Lake McGunnicook for a month out of the summer.
Yeah.
And then, but it's not their primary residence, and it's not hosted. And so how do we carve out an exception if we wanted to include that type of person? That's just sort of where I'm going with all of that, without the full ban on everybody.
Right.
And so we've heard people complaining that we're saying we're banning all rentals, all short-term rentals. That's not our intent.
Yep.
But we are looking to come at this from a reasonable perspective. And so I'd be interested in hearing your response to that. And then I want to make sure Crystal gets a chance to chime in.
Yeah. So one of the things we've seen, especially starting, probably 3 or 4 years ago, but it's certainly in the pandemic, are places like yours that have had vacation rentals for a long time. Often these properties have passed down to grandchildren even. Some of them are owned in trusts. Some of them, especially we talk to a lot in around the Great Lakes, northern Michigan and stuff, where everyone used to know each other, right? Everyone knew who built that cabin, and every year all the families would go there. And now the complaint we hear is, I don't know any of these people. I don't live here, but I don't know any of these people. When I used to come here, I used to know everyone. And that is not possible, I think, for us to regulate. We can't regulate that you have that kind of community with your neighbors again. So it does become really, really difficult to regulate, to find those exceptions and to justify those exceptions. You want to talk about lawsuits, right? Is you don't want to end up in a situation where you seem like you are favoriting someone that you have good feelings towards, when someone else is doing basically the same thing gets punished or gets kicked out of the market. One of the things we have seen, which I think is an interesting solution, is to say, if it's your primary residence, then short-term renting by definition is an accessory use of the property. It cannot be the primary use. The primary use is that it's your house, your residence. Even if you're only there 6 months and a day, it is where you pay your taxes, it's where you vote. Theoretically, it's where, your children are registered to go to school, whatever it is. Short-term renting is secondary. For everything that's not secondary, where the primary use of the property is as a vacation rental, that's where I think, so that's a dividing line. I talked about that spectrum of lodging. That's one dividing line that pushes one group to the side. And most places say if it's a primary residency, pay your taxes, have smoke detectors. We're not going to have a lot of other sort of influence on it because there's so much built-in accountability. It's your house, in your neighborhood, in your town. You legally could have a bachelor party every weekend. You probably won't, because you have to live with the consequences, I guess, of that. For everyone else, you have a lot of choices about how you want to reshape that market. Non-primary residency, even non-hosted. Non-hosted is not as important. Non-primary residency. Some places, as you said, do a cap. And they just say, we want to limit the influence of this industry on our housing market. And so if we cap it at, I think, what does Kennebunkport do? 7% or something. We know that that's the maximum influence that they can have. And I think that's generally pretty justifiable. You obviously have to figure out how to give out those licenses. I think an interesting tactic, which I've seen a little bit in New England, is a little bit of a twofer, which is to say, for non-primary residencies, we're going to set a cap. That cap is below where we are now. And that all those permits are going to expire every year. They're not lifetime permits, right? It's not like you're number 100, and if you're 101, you're on a wait list forever. Because honestly, that sort of attrition doesn't happen. You will do a lot of waiting on a wait list on short-term rentals. What we have seen, I think, which is an interesting idea, and it's maybe one to start with or to play around with in your head, is if you have these non-primary resident permits and they expire every year, it means that if you're a speculator, I'll use a loaded term. If you're an LLC, you're a speculator. You can't bank on every year getting a permit. You might be on the outside some years. And so what that means is you force some people to make choices about whether that's the investment they want, or that to recognize that some years they're going to maybe dip into the long-term market. It upsets their balance sheet a little bit. So rather than you have a set number that are just going to be short-term rentals forever, it means that everyone has a chance every year to be part of the industry, but also a chance that they may not.
And so are you envisioning there a lotto system?
You can do a lotto system. You could also do a first come, first serve. I think a lotto system is probably fairer and it's more fun, but it's certainly fairer. New Orleans had a lotto system, and they literally got like the little balls. They got the little cage and everything, which is I think fun. But I think a lotto system is fairer because some people are not going to be able to be there first come, first serve, or they're not going to camp out or whatever. Like it's Rolling Stone tickets. So you could do a lottery and just say, okay, we know that currently there's a demand for 200. We're going to say that the lottery is 100. And if you want to enter, you enter. And if you get it, you get it. So I think it's an interesting one. We're working with Narragansett in Rhode Island. They're interested in a system like that. And I think it's an innovation. It's pretty new that we've seen places do that, but I think it is a way to find some fairness in the way that you have talked about, where you want to have this industry. You don't want to necessarily do a total ban on this type of thing, although you're totally able to, I think, although you might get, again, a lot of pushback. But it also still upsets that market or churns that market enough that some other things may happen, whether that's in the long-term market or just, again, you still have that limit. There's only going to be 100. I'm making up a number, but 100. So you still have those protections because there's a certain number, but also you have that churn, which means it's maybe fairer. You have more people who are able to do that year to year. Right. So that, I think, is a real is maybe a place to start, or an idea to start with you guys to think about what that kind of division would do to achieve some of these goals. And so that one's actually, I think, is an exciting one.
That's
but
great.
There are plenty of other ways to divvy it up, obviously.
There's Chriso.
Yes, Chriso, sorry.
No. It's been a fascinating presentation. A lot of these things are some of the things we've, as Ethan said, we've been kicking around this conversation for a couple of years, actually.
Sure.
So a lot of this we've been talking about, but one of the things that we've really that we hit on, and I was hoping you guys would talk a bit more about, is the sort of the measurements, the scanning the data, the working on that side of things, because it's really hard for us as a small town to get into some of this. And, not just sort of the numbers of properties, but the numbers, like how many beds are they claiming in a 3-bedroom house? Are they claiming that they can sleep 8? We have talked about the infrastructure impact. Camden is a town that doesn't have trash pickup, for example. So that's a major factor.
Yep.
Camden does have noise ordinances and stuff like that prohibit some of the late night partying. But the piece that we struggle with, as Ethan said, we have a requirement to register currently, but there's no teeth to it, and there's no, without sort of sitting and having a town staff, Shenley or Jeremy, go sit looking at every listing and so how does that piece work from your side of things? And obviously I know you've got some proprietary things, you're not going to give us all your secrets, but that's the piece that's really hard for a small town.
Yeah, I think Samantha probably has an example that she can show or
Yeah,
describe.
so
Yeah.
I think just because of the sort of nature of this conversation, we sort of stayed away from our compliance tools, if I'm honest. But there is, like, I'll just put up a slide so that way you can see it and what it sort of represents, because it gives you a good idea of how we would go about driving compliance. And yeah, we won't delve too far into it, just in the interest of time and because that was sort of where we landed. But this is basically what we call our host compliance system. So first, what you have is that address identification, as we had spoken about before. So address identification, it really does sort of set the scene, set what's happening in the marketplace today, and then after you guys enact your ordinance. So what we're doing there is we pull down the data from the top 70 plus short-term rental platforms. We match that with your assessor data. So that's going to include the physical address, owner's address or parcel ID. You guys have Esri, so what I would suggest is tying it together with your Esri information, especially if your GIS system is sort of the source of truth. It has all of the assessor information, so it just means the two systems are constantly speaking to each other, and it is as robust as possible. So the vast majority.
I will mention that when we talk about addresses and parcels, we're also obviously getting all the listing information. So that means every address is tied to a listing and all the attributes they put in their listing, whether that's occupancy, number of bedrooms, parking, all that stuff is correlated to an address. That address then ties into your assessor, which says, do they have 2 bedrooms they're advertising for 10?
Right. And are you guys able to see addresses from listings? Because usually as a renter, you don't get the address until you've booked.
Yeah, so basically what we use is artificial intelligence in order to first identify those houses or the properties. And then afterwards, what we do is we have a team of 300 analysts. What they do is go through, find 3 data sources to confirm that each one of those matches are correct. And that's where you're getting the address information from. So This is basically similar to what you saw earlier on. You'll see that mapping count of all the short-term rentals. You click on, this is fully dynamic, so you can basically toggle between those are compliant, non-compliant, those who are not yet identified. You can turn those off, just look at those that are non-compliant, and then you click on the actual points. So I call them pins, and it'll go into the specifics of each one of those short-term rentals themselves. So as we were talking about before, if we want to look at the number that I've listed in the last 30 days, the information is there. We can split out those who are listed for more than 30 days, less than 30 days. When we talk about addresses that are identified, what we're looking at are those that we found 3 data sources to substantiate that those matches are correct. So as Jeffrey was saying before, when you click on those points, what you go into is the specifics of that short-term rental unit itself. So you can see here, the rental unit record is what we call it. This is where the actual address would be. You can see it's active in the short-term rental market. It's been identified as a short-term rental. And then we can also break down if it's compliant, if it's non-compliant, or if it's partially compliant. So as you're asking before, Chriso, about, how would you actually monitor compliance? We're actually looking at 150 data points. So, most of the things that you're looking for, whether it be, do they have a permit? We're actually tracking that on each one of the listings. Occupancy rate, we can track that on each one of the listings. So we can see here, max sleeping capacity. So if you have a property that's, say, a 3-bedroom property, you want to look at occupancy rate. What we generally see is 2 per bedroom plus 2 in a common area. So 3-bedroom house, that's looking at 8 people in that house. So if this component here, where it says max sleeping capacity of people, if it is listing 10, then we know that it's out of compliance, and that way it's flagged. So all of those different components are actually captured within the program itself. The last thing that I'll actually just point out here is that timeline of activity. So the one thing there is just having time and date stamp pictures to substantiate whatever they are doing moving forward. So our timeline of activity actually goes back to the inception of host compliance, back to when they became active within the short-term rental marketplace. So you do have the historic data, but moving forward, you actually get picture to substantiate that that person is still continued to be active within the marketplace. So it does make it very streamlined for people within Camden to be able to manage the program, because it is very holistic. It is, built from the ground up for the short-term rental market. And basically we do have a roadmap there as well that allows for, more advancements to happen within the marketplace overall. Does that sort of answer your question and sort of set the scene about, what the address identification is, what it would sort of entail? The map onto that is we can set out letters on your behalf, on your letterhead, communicating if somebody's out of compliance. We can also inform them when the registration actually becomes enacted, or when the registration is available. So we have a base of templates that you can work from. Basically, if you have a permitting and registration system, then we can tie in with your permitting and registration system. So their compliance in terms of getting a license or a permit is also speaking to our system through an API. We have a 24/7 hotline. So basically, we can track any complaints. That starts looking at zoning information, and if there are complaints within specific areas, then you will have the information around that as well. That's also very good if you have, say, a named emergency person, so that that person can be contacted and deal with whatever issues arise. We sort of spoke about the rental activity monitor when Ethan had asked the question about activity caps. So that's what we would use there. So it is very, very comprehensive. It's just sort of going through the process of creating an ordinance first, and then figuring out what it is that you want to track. And then the system is very much there to track it.
Great, thank you.
All right, I'm just looking around the room to see if anybody had any further questions. I don't know, Jeffrey and Samantha, I'm certainly going to allow you to wrap up, but I just wanted to see if anybody had any other questions.
I don't know how to raise my hand, but I have a question.
Oh, Jeannie, all you have to do is speak up and you have the floor.
I'm wondering about the contact person. If you have standards for someone, time, response, distance, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So some places put a real number on it. 1 hour is pretty common. 2 hours sometimes. Some places are very vague and just say, that they respond in a timely fashion. I mean, that's sort of setting them up to say whatever is timely is timely. There are some places that have pretty strict requirements about where that person has to live. Often it's within the state, often it's within 50 miles. I don't totally understand that. It's pretty common, but to me, if you require them to show up in an hour, then, you know, unless they got a helicopter or something, they're probably going to live local. Some places also, if you're doing something like primary residency, allow the primary resident to be that contact person. Other places say that they have to name a separate person as their contact. That is, I don't have any data about whether that's any of that is actually more or less effective. As long as it's someone and that some person is signing up that they have to do X, and X is usually respond generally in an hour. Often it doesn't have to be in person. Some places allow you to, you know, text your guests and say, hey, shut up. But they have to have some sort of response. And yeah, I would say an hour is probably the most common. You can have some of those other rules that they have to live a certain way. Other places, especially if they have a lot of property management companies, might try to tailor it to allow specifically for property managers to have certain requirements or certain rights or duties. But for the most part, especially with primary resident, it can just be the owner, and that they agree. And usually that's a checkbox on the application that they agree that they will respond in an hour to any complaint related to violating the town's ordinances. Yeah.
The one
Thanks.
thing I will say. The one
I'm
thing I
sorry,
will
go ahead.
say, no worries. The one thing I will say with like our hotline system is, again, you know, the one thing I always talk about is having the data. So because you guys are sort of at the beginning of this process, if you do have a system that you've put in place, the good thing is having the data to be able to change or make any revisions in year 2, year 3, year 4. And so that's one of the things that you really want to make sure about. And Jeffrey very much highlighted it earlier on is, you know, if you're starting to track those complaints, we can then see and we can link it back to the short-term rentals themselves. Where are those pockets that are having issues? What type of issues are still cropping up? And that really gives you sort of the ammunition that you need to make further revisions into year 2, year 3, year 4. And then also it really sort of validates if your ordinance has sort of resolved a lot of those issues as well. We know when we have a primary residence requirement, a lot of the times that, as Jeffrey had said before, those people are living local. That's their home. So, you know, they are going to vet those people a lot more carefully. And so, you know, if you're not having any complaints, then you know that that really did work. So it really does sort of validate, you know, those the rules that you have put in place.
Yeah, that's really helpful, and I'm interested to learn more about success stories for particularly to the non-primary issue, because I think that's what we're looking at here. Let's just say that you've already shown us data that 90% are single-family homes, and let's just assume that the comment that we received from someone who's in the industry that 95% of those are unhosted. Okay, so they're non-primary then, right? I mean, that's the deal. If that's the case,
well, not necessarily. I mean, if they're not hosted,
well, I may
but
have
you know what I
misspoke,
know
but
what you mean.
That's
Yeah.
exactly what was meant. Was that 95% of the rentals in town are non-primary, unhosted?
Yeah, no one's
okay.
Yeah.
So let's just say that 95% of 90% is a whole lot, right? We're looking at 300 to 350 units.
Yeah.
Something like that. You get all of the different arguments lashed out at you, right? Like, so, oh, you're going to ruin the economy because people want to come and have somewhere to stay. Well, we have a lodging industry. Obviously, the short-term rentals play a part in that. I use short-term rentals when I travel because I travel with a family or a dog, you know, and so though sometimes it's nicer to have a kitchen that you can cook in and you're going to have an extended stay or something like that.
Mhm.
I don't think they're inherently bad. So you get the arguments that, well, all of these people, I mean, if they're non-primary, technically, they're not taxpayers and voters, or they're okay, they're taxpayers, but they're not voters, right? And so we're a town, select board. We're not a city council government. So anything we do, we have to get past the voters of the town. And so as a planning board, that's our charge, is to bring forward something that is palatable. And we have our positions, and we've had numerous discussions, and I'm not sure we're unanimous in where we stand, but we are fairly concerned with the effect, in particular, to the safety and the housing issues. And I don't think we've had as much of the large partying things, although Christo is fading out. He says his internet's going. He says that there's been some stuff out in the camps on the lake, and that may well be, I may be unaware. But I don't think we have a lot of in-town property saying, oh, there's a so-and-so is throwing rager after rager every night in Camden. This town is pretty sleepy from that perspective. So we really are focused more on the housing availability and the safety issues. And of course, all the other ones are still relevant. And so I'm just curious as to, is that part of your service, is to say, here's your best path forward to accomplish your goals? Or is it more like, here's the things we offer, and you sort of pick and choose among it what works best for you, or what you think works?
So we can do both. I mean, one piece that Samantha did not mention on our range of services is consulting, and working with local governments to write an ordinance, to develop the framework for an ordinance, to run public meetings, to do public outreach. Those sorts of things are services that we do, largely I do. And for if nothing else, I do want to say that, like, my personal planning philosophy is, I am not Moses on the mountaintop. I want to make sure that everything you do is something that derives from the values of your community. And I think that's a really important thing. So I can advise you on best practices. I can talk about what the trade-offs would be for certain policies. I can talk to you about what other communities' experiences were. But ultimately, as you said, your charge is with your community and with the people who live there in the place that you really love. In terms of places to look at, I think that beyond some of the ones that I know you've mentioned, Lake Placid in New York just changed their ordinance, I believe, at the beginning of this year, where they have moved to largely outlaw non-primary residence short-term rentals. Now, Lake Placid's a big destination. They expressed a lot of very similar things to I think what we've heard here, which is just, is this compatible with their community and the way they want their community to be? They obviously had the ability or the will to make that happen. I think there is still some avenue to be a non-primary residence short-term rental, but it's much more commercial. And I think that is actually where we see a lot of places start to go, is to say, if the main purpose of this property is not residential, it is taking place in a residential form, but it is not residential, we are going to treat you as a business, as a commercial entity. And whether that's create a new sense of what it means to be a bed and breakfast in the 21st century, or whether that's to say that is not something that we think we want in this form, that you can't have your cake and eat it too, that's up to you guys. But we do see that segment of the short-term rental industry, places making different choices about how they want to fit that into their community, into their code. And some places reject it, or say that if they want to keep doing it, they can become a bed and breakfast like anyone else, or they could live in it and still be a short-term rental. So it's on the table. And there are, I think, a lot of communities, especially in New England, in upstate New York, that are using this as a vehicle about housing. And I'll planning is often about saying no. It's part of the profession, but I will say that short-term renting is one of the few pieces of the housing market that local governments have control over. You don't have control over
Right.
the interest rates. You don't have control over global flows of capital. You don't have control over almost anything about housing, I suppose. Short-term renting, who gets to do it, where they can do it, how many there can be, is something you actually do have strong local control over. And so I think it does behoove you to try to exert that control in a way that you think is going to best fit your community. That doesn't mean necessarily a ban. That could mean any number of things. But
Right.
it
Right.
is. I sort of mention that because it's true. It's true when we talk about housing, and I came from housing to short-term renting as an issue, and it is very frustrating because you think about all these things that you cannot control. This is one that
Right.
you do have some influence on, and so yeah, you do have to kind of take it seriously if you want to make it a housing issue and you want to pursue that as your main goal. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's really helpful. And thank you again, Jeffrey and Samantha, both. One of the things that we've heard, and I'm curious again. I'm going to ask a question, but I'll pontificate for a second. We've heard some things about, well, just taking it out of the short-term rental market doesn't guarantee it goes into the long-term rental market. The house may just stay empty, or these sorts of concerns. And also, Jeremy had shared around, I think, with the board a while back, a short blog post by Granicus on, housing availability and short-term rental regulation and the link there too. We've been questioned. To me, it seems absolutely logical, right?
Mm-hmm.
I look at the issue and I say, you take these properties out of the short-term rental market, they're either going to go into the real estate market and be available for purchase,
Mm-hmm.
which would ostensibly lower prices if enough of them came out, right? I'm not saying it's going to happen overnight, or they're going to go into the long-term rental market if the person wants to have an investment property. And that seems completely logical, but we've been challenged on that by, people in the town that's questioning whether there's a link to that. We know we're not solving the housing crisis by going after short-term rentals. And I've described it as sort of one prong on a fork as like we try to go after all the issues. And the state of Maine has been very active also in promoting all these new things. And some of them, feel a little bit onerous for local municipalities. They may not have planned them out perfectly, but we're talking about density and smaller lot sizes and allowing, second residences on a lot and things like that. So all of these things are happening. Of course, we all know the solution to the housing availability issue is for municipalities to build more housing, right? We all know that. That's also a challenging proposition. So we understand that whole dynamic of the entire thing, but it is helpful, or would be helpful, to have more specifics from Granicus on the link between reduction in short-term housing and the availability of housing. And we do focus largely on workforce housing. And you nailed it when you said, sure, there are servers and there's people that are bussing the tables, but we are talking a lot about teachers and fire folk and police persons and everybody else who can't afford to live in our town. We've had people come in and speak to us at the planning board and say, I can't hire somebody for my restaurant because they have to drive 45 minutes just to get to work.
Right. And we've seen this come up too with like places, that have only a few roads in a town. So Colorado's ski towns or something. They're now having to think about expanding the roads into town because they have traffic. They never had traffic before, and it's all people who have to commute in to work. That's not sustainable. That's not a good outcome for anyone, let alone any of these communities. So I can send some academic papers to start with, if nothing else, about the effects of short-term rentals on housing availability and affordability. It is, people say that there's no link. There's a very obvious link, and it has been shown in study after study, even in some small towns, that that these are just related. Basic supply and demand would tell you that these things are related. Whether people want to believe it or not, that's their choice. I will say there are some, I think, innovations going on with housing and short-term rentals that I guess I'll mention two of them. One is in places where you do have development or density changes that you can now do. We have seen some places propose the idea of, well, in most places, ADUs, accessory dwelling units, are not allowed to be short-term rentals because they are promised as a path to more units to affordability. What we have seen a couple places propose is that you can do a short-term rental in an ADU, but only for the first 3 years of it. And it's a way to try to goose ADU development, which is to say, if you can make that little extra money from, to pay back your construction loan or whatever for those first few years, then maybe people will go, oh, now it's actually worth it for me to take that money out and build it because I'll make that bonus return. And then the restriction is after 3 years or 5 years or whatever it is, it has to become long-term housing or even affordable.
Yeah, that's a really interesting proposal and something, because that's the other thing is we know we're not going to see in 1 year all of a sudden everybody can afford to live in Camden.
No.
Right? Like
Right.
that's like we may have a 5-year goal to make it better.
Mhm.
But we have to try to approach this from a longer term perspective, and that's something that's interesting because I hear what you're saying. It does allow someone to recoup the costs of constructing an ADU. We do have that kind of restriction in Camden that an ADU is not permitted, and we also have a restriction in Camden that's sort of in the books that all short-term rentals have to be a minimum of 7 days. You can imagine how well that's being honored.
Right.
And
Right.
the enforcement on it is zilch.
Yeah.
But we've sort of interpreted it as, well, 1 rental per 7-day period,
Mhm.
right? And I think that's how it's been kind of interpreted in town. But even that's not being enforced. And so,
Yeah.
and how
Or there's
could
so
you,
many
right?
loopholes. I
Right.
know so many
Right.
places where you have hosts who say, okay, well, you prepay for the first 2 days and there's no penalty if you break your lease. Okay, well, that's a weekend and then I'm out, right? So that, again, getting back to those day counting things, it's just always a hassle. The other one that I'll mention, which is maybe not, I'm always intrigued by these ones that take this demand. We know that there's this huge demand for short-term rentals. How do we parlay that into these other goals? Because we have some leverage there. Taos County, New Mexico is working through its ordinance right now. It's the county around Taos, but not Taos itself. And one of the ideas that they have been floating, which I don't think has I think they're still in the process of, is sort of fine-tuning that Sedona problem. And what they're doing is they're going to have a cap, and that cap is pretty low. They're going to say, if you want to continue to do short-term renting outside of that cap, we want something from you for that privilege, right? And what they have floated, and now granted they're counties, they're a much bigger place, is you as the short-term rental host, you need to subsidize housing, long-term housing, somewhere else in the county. Doesn't have to be on the site, it just has to be somewhere. Now, obviously, there's a lot of details to that. Do the bedrooms match up? What happens if you decide to leave short-term renting? Do you have to continue the subsidy? I mean, whatever it is. But I think it's a really interesting idea to shift that subsidy burden from the public sphere into a sort of private transaction. That's probably not something you can directly translate to Camden, but
Right.
I think it's an interesting way to think about, if you hold that leverage, if you have something like a cap and you have leverage because there's so much more demand than the cap that you set, and always set your cap lower than the existing problem. That gives you leverage to start to say, maybe not sort of like you're the Godfather, but like, what do you want to give me right here, right? What can we get to give
You
you
really
that.
missed your shot at doing an Al Pacino for me, or a Marlon
I knew
Brando.
better. I knew
Um,
better than that. But you're getting at what I'm getting at, which is the idea is
Yeah.
if you have something like a cap and you still have all this other demand, now you have leverage, and now you have the ability to extract something, and that something is going to be, I think, particular to your built
Yeah,
environment. to your
and
real
just
estate.
to an earlier statement that you made, and I think I'm just spitballing here, but I have pretty good information that something that would normally cost $1,500 to $2,000, and our rental long-term rental market is pretty inflated here because of lack of availability.
Yep.
But let's just go back to a couple of years ago, like during COVID, when there was actually short-term rentals weren't flying around because there was all these concerns and everything.
Yeah.
Some place that would rent for around $1,500 could turn around and rent for $4,000 a month on a short-term rental basis during the season, right? Now it's not all year round, but that's 4 or 5 months out of the year. That's the kind of disparity that we're looking at. And so I see what you're saying is like those people who are taking in those profits could turn around and provide some sort of subsidy back.
Yep. And some places it's very simple. Some places just do not as, for all short-term rentals, that there's a affordable housing fund. That's good. Money is good. The problem is, I think, as I'm sure all of you know, the amount of money that you get from a tax or a fee like that, you're not building a unit. You can't acquire the land. You can't acquire the material. It's money. It can go to other things. It can go to, I've seen some places do it for homelessness services or subsidies or whatever. I mean, it's money. You can use money for things. But I do think some of these ideas, especially around a cap or other kinds of restriction where you generate that leverage, I think that's something, to pour yourself a cocktail and stare out the window and think about, what that would look like, or what you could use that kind of, that desire to further some of these housing goals that otherwise you look at it and you go, well, we don't have the money to do any of these things. Maybe there is money for it, but you're only going to get it if you have these kinds of restrictions that make short-term renting, the ability to do short-term renting, valuable. Right.
Wow, this has been just phenomenal. Like really, really, I think instructive and helpful. And I see some nodding heads. I also see some nodding sleepy heads. So I do want to I want to give you an opportunity to wrap it up, but I want to make sure that nobody else on the board has any comments or questions before we do. And then again, I'll just say right now, thank you so much for your time and for your presentation, and then allow you to get, have a little wrap up here, and then we'll close it. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I'll do my little wrap up, and Samantha has a more formal one, which is, obviously I can talk about this forever. My wife is a very, very patient woman. And just, if there are other questions or other things come up, I'm always available to talk about it, or there are other people that you want me to talk to. I will briefly put on a salesman's hat and say, I do consulting. That consulting can take many forms. Everything from just set number of hours to running a whole road show to anything you need. So if there are things that I can do, obviously we can keep that conversation going. But otherwise, it's always a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to talk to people and to hear about all the good things that are happening around the country.
Perfect. Thanks so much. I should have mentioned the consulting services. I know Jeffrey actually is consulting for quite a few of my customers already. And so, I think, you guys are sort of at the beginning. You have sort of a base and you know what your goals are already, but just getting it through and understanding what those options are, as I said at the beginning, that really is where he shines, and coming up with something, a framework, sort of amalgamating all of the different options and looking at, okay, at the end of this, we can go down this path. This is where I think you should go. Let's continue to really drive down to like your goal, but as well, something that is functional, something that can be enforceable. And getting out the other side is where I sort of shine in terms of being able to drive that compliance through. The sky's the limit. We are really here as a partner. So yeah, just feel free to reach out to us. if you do have any questions. I will send through our contact details are already on the slide deck that you guys have. So yeah, like feel free to use this as a resource. I think there was a question about success stories. I'll send some of those through as well. We actually do have a full page link that does go through success stories, but I'll try and pick out some that I think are most pertinent to you, and come back and ask questions. I think we do know that, like, I've been speaking to Camden since 2019. So I think, you know, we do know that this is a process. So yeah, feel free to use this as a resource as you go through this process.
That's great. Yeah, we are moving, you know, slowly and methodically, but conscientiously, and we do want to make sure that's part of our thing, is to make sure that the public is aware and that they're able to participate. But yeah, those success stories would be fantastic, Samantha. And Jeffrey, you promised some academic articles. There are enough of us on the board who will geek out on those.
Sure.
So please do send those along as well. And again, thank you so much for your time and your presentation. And thanks to Shenley and Jeremy for all that you do to help set this up.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, guys. Take care.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
And I think that's basically it for the board. I don't think we need to have any large discussion right now, unless people are itching to carry on for a bit. It's been quite a long meeting, but I think very informative, and I think we've gained a lot of information about what services Granicus can provide, but also even just, you know, without that, like, different ideas of how things can be done. And I think we have a lot to think about. You know, I don't know about the rest of the board when they say, well, you're at the very beginning of this, if you bristle. We are, because we haven't written an ordinance, but man, I feel like we've been at this, you know, and so I want to just acknowledge all the effort that we've all put in and the thought. And even if we are at sort of the nascent stages of creating an ordinance, we have moved, you know, we have moved mountains as far as like what we've looked at as far as neighboring towns and all the work that Pat has done and talking to other towns and considering all the options. And I think even a couple of our workshops and meeting with the select board and all of that, and welcoming the community into these discussions. So I understand the perception that we are at the very beginning because we have nothing written on paper as far as an ordinance, but the goals that we provide, that we have, that Shenley works so hard on and everything, that's tangible, real product, and things that almost, you know, sort of, I mean, I think it cut out about a fifth of their presentation, right? Because they're going to talk about all that stuff, and then all of a sudden, like, oh, you've got that. Okay, well, we'll move on to the next slide. I think that's important, and that we've considered all those things. So, thank you all for your time and your attention to this, and we'll circle back on this next time. But I have been sending out some articles. You may have read them on New York and places like that, and you know, it's interesting what's going on around the world. There's a lot of activity on this stuff, and in the end, I think as a board, our goal should be to try to consider every option and do what's best for the community and fair to the residents of our community.
So I have a question perhaps for Shenley. It's like, what's next? Or am I correct? Are we shooting for having an ordinance in place
Before, I think, spring, or because we want to look at next summer, right?
and there's
So I think around February, March, it has to be by you guys.
okay,
or
and
even the select
so
board.
there I think we ought to have another sort of public outreach focus
Oh,
meeting
definitely.
sooner than later.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah, we have your next meetings. We have, I know Jeremy wanted to go over, well, short-term rentals again and peer
Right.
shop.
Hmm.
That is coming. Our next meeting would be like the 21st of September, and then we have October 5th and October 19th coming up. So those are,
Yeah. Yeah, all those are pretty much free, right? No applications pending.
not that I know of.
So yeah, so John, the summer respite is over, and you can expect it like every 2 weeks we're going to be hitting on this. So I think that's really the goal here, and I I hear and I bristle, like I said, about like we're at the very beginning stages, but I understand we are. But I really do want to hammer through these issues and work through it as a board and come up with what we think is best for Camden and get something before the voters next summer. And that is, as Shenley said, sort of a February, March timeline to have something final.
So I was listening to some of the comments from our Granicus folks and how they used a press leak to drive certain components of their enforcement action. And I'm interested in driving our public input. So maybe a good thing to do would be to leak to the press Ethan's comments about how he wants to prohibit any non-owner occupied short-term rentals and get people to our next discussion.
Now I'm going to say, John,
I
I think you've already just accomplished it. Now I am going to say, you know, we have talked about that. I'm not even saying that I advocate for that. However, I do think that is the core problem in our town. And so how we come about regulating the discussion on day or week limits and how difficult that is to regulate was very insightful and helpful for me, because I was kind of on that line thinking that was a good way to go, and then hearing how hard it is to enforce. So I'm open to whatever we as a board can come up with. But absolutely, if 95% of our 90% rentals are unhosted, non-primary, I'm sorry, they're going to be a focus. And that's, otherwise we're doing nothing. Like, what are we going to do? Regulate somebody who's renting out a room, or regulate somebody who's got a room over their garage that they want to rent out? No, we're going out. We're looking at the people who are buying a property and putting them into the short-term rental market exclusively. And that's. I think I'll stand, and yeah, I will die on that hill.
I was just debriefing here. I was a little bit discouraged coming into tonight's discussion. I had this concept that we could do sort of a two-step, and the first effort would be to invigorate registration, by working with Airbnb and VRBO and start to get a better handle on what's out there. And some initial life safety issues and, requirements for people to communicate with their renters, how to behave correctly and so forth. And then if issues started to come in over time, we would be able to respond to that, based on facts. And I'm not quite so sure we can do that anymore.
Yeah, I heard that as well, and I kind of, a lot like you, assumed, like when I saw the Maine state tax pop up on an Airbnb rental, I was like, oh, we must be able to send to them, say this is now required, and you have to collect it, right?
Yeah.
But Camden doesn't have the same muscle as the state of Maine. And the question about auditing came up, and whether or not even Maine knows whether or not they're getting the right amount of dollars back per rental. It's pretty hard to track. So yeah, that's something to think about. Yeah. So anyway, yeah, we were trying. We're now reaching the 7:30 mark. So all good stuff. Just remember, discussions shouldn't happen over email. Because that constitutes a public hearing or a public meeting. So sending a link to an article is fine, but having any discussion on it is not necessarily the way we want to go. So if we want to schedule some sort of time to talk outside of our meeting, we can do that. But right now we're looking at 2 weeks from now. Is that right, Shenley?
Yes, the 21st is your next.
Anybody have a problem with that? for a meeting time?
I don't think so.
We don't have Crystal on here, but I think most people are expecting that now. Just expect that we're going to roll with the generally that every 2 weeks schedule unless
Okay,
we get an application that needs some sort of urgency or something like that.
right.
And any scheduled meeting could be trumped or usurped by an application that requires, attention. But we're really going to lean into the short-term rental stuff now.
Okay. sounds
Chriso,
good.
I don't think Chriso's here on the 21st. I think he's gone, so.
Yeah. Chris on his vacations. I can't, but I do think that he's capable of watching on the YouTube channel and then providing his insight and providing comments ahead of time are absolutely appropriate as well. So we've heard a lot. I think he may have missed about half of the presentation. And so he'll follow up on that too. I took a page of notes and did a lot of really interesting stuff. So
Do you want to continue your discussion on this at the next meeting, make that agenda item?
well, I think that should be agenda item 1. Yeah, it should be our continued thoughts on the Granicus presentation.
Okay.
We're not right now deciding whether or not to hire Granicus. That's a little premature. But we were given a lot of information about the types of things we could be looking at and what these organizations can do. And we could certainly bring in another one to have somebody else give us the same presentation and see how they differ. That's something we could talk about next time, whether, it's not bad to get a second opinion.
Right.
I certainly liked Jeffrey and Samantha. I thought they were able to listen and adapt and to sort of, hear what we were saying. So the services the services range from, just providing data and access, and then to, as you saw, the enforcement, and then consulting and all sorts of different things. And so we don't always have to buy in at whatever level. So let's just consider all that and bring it to the next meeting.
Perfect. Okay. Perfect.
All right,
Awesome.
Thank
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
You guys.
Take care.
Bye.
Oh.
Good night.